pleasure to be able to introduce my friend and colleague, Rebecca Helm. She's been an inspiration to me in many ways. Dr. Helm studies the surface of the oceans and has done some incredible work on jellyfish and the evolution of life with plastic environments. And she's also an incredible communicator of science. She has articles written in the Atlantic and Slate in Biographic, and takes science to international settings where she has been a voice in UN negotiations on plastics, as well as the UN biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. Got it. Okay. She has a Ph.D. in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from Brown, on a postdoc from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, as well as she's also an NSF Postdoctoral Fellow at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. She travels a ton with her work, chasing jellyfish around the world and negotiations around the world. And she's also lived around the world in Namibia, South Africa, France, across the United States. I'm very excited to hear what you have to say, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming today. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces. So today you're getting a brand new talk. So you are sort of testers. There's some stuff that maybe you've seen before, but a lot of new stuff. I can take small questions during the talk, but if you have big questions, I'm happy to take all of those at that. So today, I hope to convince you that the surface of the ocean, and more broadly, the ocean beyond national jurisdiction, which we call the high seas, is something worth thinking about, even though it's quite out of sight and out of mind for most of us. And this is my favorite view of our planet. This is all of the stuff that my lab and I study, and it's a lot more than you might think. So if we flatten this out and look at a map of the broader ocean, all of the light blue that you can see in there is within our various nations' jurisdictions. So that's all stuff that more or less sort of belongs to different states or countries where they can fish, where they can mine. But all the dark blue stuff is area beyond national jurisdiction. So this falls under any one nation's territory. We refer to it colloquially as the high seas. And the high seas are, by definition, kind of a multilateral problem, right? They are only regulated by sort of international authority. And this creates some really interesting opportunities and challenges for us marine biologists who just like studying weird, interesting, squishy animals and want to make sure our weird, interesting, squishy animals are conserved and protected for generations to come. So about 29% of Earth is the dirt that we are all familiar with. So all of the Earth that you can kind of imagine as terrestrial only makes up this relatively small fraction. And the rest of the area of the high seas makes up about 43% of Earth's surface. So we're thinking about sort of double of the kinds of protections that we need on land. Just to visualize this, that is almost twice the size of the planet Mars. So we have a major challenge from a legal and scientific perspective. How do we study this whole other world that we can barely see? And even though we don't see it, we feel its impact every single day. So the high seas is responsible for about $16 billion every year in annual fisheries catch. So the high seas is feeding a lot of people. It is sequestering up to $200 billion worth of carbon from our atmosphere and mitigating the impact of climate change and global warming. But we have this general visualization problem that I see at every level of discussion, from chatting with people in kindergarten classrooms all the way up to the halls of the United Nations, which is that it's really hard to visualize the kinds of life that live in this area of our planet. Okay. So I want you to take a moment just yourself and see if you can come up with an animal or an algae or maybe a microbe that's entirely high seas. People might say anglerfish. We might get a couple of whales, maybe a giant squid. But given that this makes up over 90% of Earth's livable volume, because we've got both area and depth, that's a very small percentage relative to what we can think about on land. And Google and AI are no better, right? So if you Google biodiversity on Earth, you get a lot of birds. So Pete's, I'm sure, very happy about that. Congratulations on whatever you did to make that like the top hit. You also get a lot of rainforest, right? But what you don't get on this 29.2% is, what we're seeing beyond. 27% of Earth's surface is within national jurisdiction. This is most of our coral reefs. So for any of you that thought about coral reefs, I hate to break it to you, that really doesn't count for most high seas places, along with mangrove marshes. So my goal for you today, in addition to showing you cool pictures of turtles, is to share with you what's beyond this 43% of the high seas. So what is out there and how do we conserve and protect it? As conservation biologists, how do we set aside something that we don't really understand? And this is a broad challenge in the context of what we conserve in general. So on Earth's surface, about 12.7% of land is under some kind of biodiversity environmental protection. Okay, so those are our national parks, those are our various preserves. Then we have, for those exclusive economic zones, the light blue, we have about 2%. So already you've seen order of magnitude collapse in the amount of area that we're actually meaningfully protecting. And by the time you get out to that 43% of Earth's surface, you have less than 1% of the high seas having any meaningful form of conservation environmental protection. But of course, all of our human impacts have no idea what a national border is or what an exclusive economic zone is. So we have pollution as a major impact on the high seas. This is a map of world cargo shipping lanes. So I mean, just imagine all the stuff that you order on Amazon, right? Has to cross on one of these shipping lanes, right? So you get it in 2 days and it's very convenient. But of course, the high seas are becoming increasingly trafficked, and this is creating all kinds of pollution, both literal pollution and chemicals, but also noise pollution. We have emerging challenges to the high seas, such as geoengineering, particularly iron fertilization, which is proposing to just dump large amounts of iron into the high seas. And I actually heard someone say at a major scientific meeting, well, there's no life out there. So it's a great place to do this kind of work. Not going to impact anything. Yeah, and I think I audibly squeaked in the audience. And then we also, of course, have plastic pollution, which is probably the biggest area that sort of people have heard of when it comes to high seas, because these synthetic plastic particles that we've modeled here tend to concentrate in regions of the high seas called gyres, which have been rather unfortunately dubbed as garbage patches. And we have the largest or the most well-studied, I should say, of those garbage patches sort of right off the California coast. But of course, shout out as well to fisheries and the impacts that fisheries are having. So we have this high seas, it's bigger than the surface of a planet, but where do we start in terms of conservation and protection? And so when I was thinking about this as a biologist, one thing that stood out was that many of our human impacts happen right at the air-sea interface. They're happening right where the ocean meets the atmosphere. And much of the services that we get from the high seas, such as carbon sequestration, happen as a result of this air-sea interface, right? So this is like the fragile skin that covers Earth's surface and mediates all of these exchanges between the atmosphere, the land, and the ocean. So nearly all human impacts have to travel through the surface, and it is really on the front line of what we do on the high seas. So I'd like to introduce you to some of the life that lives at this air-sea interface and maybe expand a little bit your visualization of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. So for the next couple of minutes, we're just going to do animal show and tell. So animals that live at the air-sea interface are colloquially called neustonic animals. So it's from a Greek word that means sort of to drift or swim. And so we have a variety of different species that can be found right at this borderland. Out of curiosity, does anyone recognize this animal? Hands. All right, oh cool, I'm seeing a couple people, excellent. So this is by-the-wind sailor. This is a kind of jelly. It is the only waterproof jelly that I know of. It has a waterproof sail that extends out of the water and then a ring of blue tentacles below the water. And it uses those tentacles to catch prey, which you can see here. And it uses that sail to sort of harness energy from the wind. And these by-the-wind sailors can be about as big as my hand. And you might think, well, I've never heard of them. They must not be that impactful. But this is a sort of living island of by-the-wind sailors that's stretching for kilometers. They are completely covering the ocean surface off of La Push in Washington state. So they have a major impact on the ocean ecosystems along the sort of western US current. This is another relative of the by-the-wind sailor called the blue button, Porpita porpita, another jelly that has this nice float right in the middle and pulses these tentacles in and out to catch prey. This might be the most infamous member of our surface ecosystem. So this is the Portuguese man-o-war or Physalia. These pack a nasty sting. So if you've been to the beach and been stung by a jelly, it could have been one of these guys. I hope not. They send a number of people to the hospital every year. So definitely a look, don't touch kind of a species. But they also have a fleshy sail and long tentacles that they use as a kind of sea anchor to drogue them against the wind and essentially navigate at the ocean surface, even though they're sort of brainless. These animals are sort of core members of this neustonic food web at the ocean surface, but there are a variety of predators that eat them. So this, for example, is a kind of sea slug or nudibranch called Glaucus atlanticus, and they have these fleshy hands that they use to grab onto their prey. And so they just drift around. Imagine if you couldn't move, you couldn't swim, so you just float all day long with your little hands spread like you're so excited to be here, right? And then when something bumps into one of your fingers, you grab a hold. So here's an example of, ooh, yeah, definitely, gotta get it. So they grab on, and then they'll crawl underneath and eat this, in this case, poor by-the-wind sailor that some really mean scientists put together with the sea slug because this fascinating kind of behavior is rarely seen. This is probably one of the either most peaceful or most stressed out animals that I've ever heard of. This is a violet snail Yanthina. These form bubble rafts by dipping their body into the air, grabbing a little bit of air and wrapping that air in a bubble of snail slime. So you're seeing it make its little raft right now by attaching one of those bubbles. They cannot swim. They cannot control their movement, and they're very heavy. So if the bubble raft pops, if they are dislodged, if they let go, they will just sink into the abyss and die. Because they can't control their movement, they're also dependent on currents to bring them in contact with prey. But if their prey is aggressive or they crawl onto their prey to try to eat better and they sink the prey, then again, just into the abyss to die. They also need to meet other snails in order to mate and exchange eggs and sperm. But it turns out that in addition to needing to meet other snails, they're also cannibalistic. So if you meet the wrong snail partner, you're eaten or you sink into the abyss and die. So this poor snail has a really hard life at the ocean surface. But they're also one of the fastest species or groups of species of snails that I've ever seen. So here we've got this nice snail resting on the surface. You can see it's reflected in the air-sea interface. We have a by-the-wind sailor, Philella, that again, another very mean scientist is going to push towards the snail. And as soon as that Philella hits, we get a heron-like or egret-like strike, really fast animals for being from such a slow group. It'll usually take about one bite. If it can grab on, it will. If it can't grab on, then it has to wait until the waves and the wind push them together again. So there he's taken a little bite. And here they are, two snails meeting. They're exchanging their various eggs and sperm, and then they will presumably drift along their way. Here's what else is really weird, and I don't have an answer to this, so I'm showing you a mystery, an animal mystery with no answer. After I took that first video, I was like, gotta do it again. Gotta get data from above. Let me push that little by the wind sailor back towards the snail. Here we are, trying to push it. Okay, why is this? Okay, it's getting really hard. What's going on? Some sort of force field has been popped around that by the wind sailor. I don't know what it is. I don't know what they did, but I couldn't push them back together. So imagine being this poor snail. You have no way to control your movement. And you take a bite from this wonderful, luscious prey that you finally found, you finally bumped into, and it turns out that was it. That was your only bump. And you'll get no more bumps again. So it is a bizarre habitat that confounds myself and snails alike, and we don't know a lot about it. But what we do know is that many of the species that end up most impacted by human pollutants, things like sea turtles or seabirds, are predators of these animals that live at the air-sea interface, of neustonic animals. So we see large percentages of Velella and snails in the diet of things like Lysan albatross, sort of the poster child. If you've ever seen the picture of the dead albatross chick on a beach, that's that one. They eat a ton of neustonic animals. Same with turtles. You've probably seen the video of the turtle with the straw in its nose, right? These are animals that are trying to eat neustonic prey. So understanding the air-sea interface at the high seas can also help us understand how animals are being impacted by human activity. And we have some interesting clues about their biology, such as the fact that they must be in physical contact with prey and can't really move around. And they also have to be in physical contact in order to mate. So this suggests that somewhere out on the ocean surface, we have large numbers of these animals aggregating into specific regions, right? That they have these adaptations to high densities. So for today's talk, I'm gonna first take a step back and examine sort of where these organisms come from, almost on a geological scale. Because as conservation biologists, one of the ways that we can infer how best to protect a habitat or an organism is to sort of understand its evolutionary history and make inferences about how to protect them in relation to species that we're already conserving in other areas. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about where they're concentrated and why we think that might be, and then the work we are doing to try to conserve this ecosystem. So let's start here and zoom through a tiny bit of evolutionary theory. So the ocean surface is close to all the water below, which we call the pelagic zone. So this is a bit of ocean jargon. The pelagic zone can be thought of as everything between the surface and the seafloor. So it's that huge body of water that extends down to the benthos, which is the seafloor. And it's got some particular challenges when it comes to conservation. One of which being that nothing really sits still, right? Everything is moving in sort of multiple directions in a 3D space. So these are jellyfish and copepods and various fish. And so we had initially hypothesized that stuff at the ocean surface probably evolved from this pelagic zone and probably has similar kind of all over the place constraints and requirements when it comes to conservation. So to give you an example of how different the pelagic zone is when it comes to conserving different species, think about something like a national park, right? You might establish Yellowstone because you know the wolves are largely going to stay within the bounds of that particular park, right? Now imagine if that Yellowstone park was moving with all the wolves and all the squirrels and all of the trees and everything else, like 1,000 kilometers north and 1,000 kilometers south and 1,000 kilometers east and west every year, just sloshing around. And oh, by the way, it's going into the clouds sometimes, right? And it's coming back down. So these protected areas that we're so used to just drawing a map around don't necessarily work that well on the high seas. So by asking, are these sort of related to and from this zone, we can sort of ask ourselves, what kinds of protections might they need? And this is in contrast to something like the seafloor, which we call the benthic zone, where stuff's just stuck. So if you want to conserve the Great Barrier Reef, great, you just draw a line around it. right? You sort of know where that reef is, you know where it's going to be tomorrow. And we also had clues that there was interesting life that was similar to what we were seeing on the surface. So I feel like this talk could alternately be titled Weird Snail Talk. So we have yet another weird snail. So this kind of snail flaps around with two little wings, and we see lots of these kinds of snails called pteropods in the pelagic zone. So we're thinking our big surface snail is probably just like one of these guys that's sort of stuck on the surface. All right, so let's see if we were right. So in order to test whether or not we were right, I'm not going to bore you too much with the details, but we constructed essentially family trees of life at the ocean surface and looked at all the species that were most closely related to them. And we thought this was going to be really easy. We thought, okay, we've got our different zones. So we've got the seafloor, we've got stuff that lives on other stuff, which we call epibiotic. We've got stuff that sticks to stuff that's dead, which we call rafting, which is if you get on a wooden boat and you ride around in a wooden boat, technically you are a rafter for a little while, right? Then we have stuff that's in the water column, which I just showed you, pelagic. And then of course we have the stuff that's right at the surface. And so we color coded all of these. And so what I want to point out is that pelagic is blue, and we think blue and pink are going to be together. And so here's an example of like a rafting organism that's stuck to a log, right? And let's see what we got. All right, so first we did these Portuguese man-o-war. Oh my God, and we were so right. Right, blue and pink are together. Black is outside. You don't need to worry too much about all the little animals, but we got the blue and the pink, so we're thinking, hey, we're pretty smart. Then we did the snails. Oh no. Oh no, where's the blue? There's no blue anywhere. In fact, the snails that we see at the ocean surface are most closely related to snails that live on coral reefs and at the seashore at the bottom of the ocean. We spent all this time looking at all of these drifting snails, and it turns out none of those drifting snails were anywhere near these species. So that was really wild. We were sort of like, okay, we've got our nudibranchs, we've got our sea slugs, not again. So once again, we see that these animals are coming primarily from an evolutionary sense from the seafloor, not from this middle part of the water column. All right, so we've got a couple more species. Here again, we're seeing that these animals are coming primarily from either seafloor species, or green is animals living on other animals. So they're on the seafloor, but they're like riding around on the shell of a snail, or they're riding around on the shell of a crab. And finally, at this point, we're starting to see the writing on the wall. Even for barnacles, they're coming from the seafloor, going through the riding around on other animals phase, then possibly going through a riding around on like boats phase, and then finally up to the surface. So the air-sea interface seems much more analogous to something like the seafloor than the pelagic zone. So it turns out we were wrong. 4 out of the 5 lineages likely evolved from the seafloor or from riding around on things on the seafloor or riding around on things at the surface. And this matters because now we can start thinking, okay, maybe there are ways to construct parks or other areas that don't necessarily have to capture this multidimensional space quite as aggressively. But it also means that they may have similar kinds of challenges or constraints that animals in the open ocean don't have. So it's relatively two-dimensional. We see that they're likely using modified structures for attachment to float at the ocean surface. And it's kind of like an upside down surface. So interfaces seem to be a really interesting place to be an animal, whether it's the seafloor or the surface. So many come from seafloor ancestors, giving them sort of similar potential challenges, as well as conservation opportunities. But where the heck are they, right? And why? So this was the next question that we were really curious about. And for this, I partnered with oceanographer Nikolai Maximenko at the University of Hawaii. This is someone that I cold emailed out of the blue, and I was a little nervous to email him because he clearly put a lot of time and effort into the methods that he uses to track stuff at the ocean surface, see where it's all floating around. That's his whole shtick. He just looks at where stuff floats on the ocean surface, things like garbage, things like marine debris, and he copyrighted it. So I was like, oh dang, okay, I really want to make sure I like don't piss him off. But then I looked a little closer at the copyright. Felt much better. He is one of my favorite people, truly one of the nicest guys. Here's the first thing we did together. So this is a map of the ocean surface. And here we have a gradient of where we would expect something like a floating snail or a porpita or one of these glaucus, things that can't harness the wind, where we would expect them to float to over time. So if you just let them float forever and ever, eventually they seem to all concentrate in this area of the surface. Anyone recognize that area of the surface from earlier in the talk? Yeah, so this is also the region that we call the garbage patch. If you have a sail, you get to escape the garbage patch a little bit, but you're still primarily located within this garbage patch region. So this became the hypothesis for where all these animals might be concentrating. And I want to emphasize that they're not concentrating there because there's plastic there. There are no plastics in these in silico computer models for where these animals will go. This is just where currents take stuff that floats. And all of these animals float just like plastic floats. In fact, when we went back into the historical literature and looked at all the places where something like a by-the-wind sailor was found, you can see there's pretty strong overlap between where we predict that they're going to be and where they've actually been seen before. So here we have this potential garbage patch region. And even though on the relative scale of the high seas, it's close to shore, it's still several thousand kilometers away. It costs about $50,000 a day to operate a boat like this. It's really hard to study the high seas. It's really expensive. So while we were trying to figure out how to get out to the garbage patch, we got an email from this guy right here. So we got an email from a guy named Ben Lecomte, and he said, hey, I just finished swimming from Japan to Hawaii. And I'd like to swim now. I'd like to finish my Pacific swim by swimming from Hawaii to the United States, coastal US. And at first, honest to God, I was like, spam. No, you didn't. Yes, he did. He actually swam from, across the Pacific, and he said, I want to swim through this garbage patch. But as I mentioned, right, it's swirly. The ocean surface is swirly. So he wants to target the exact middle, and we have the computer models to sort of help us do that. So here's his swim. It's called the vortex swim through the garbage patch. And here's what he actually did. So this is his actual track. You can see, and he was very kind to make like an Arizona-sized little loop for us, right in the middle of the garbage patch, where he collected samples with a net at the surface. So let me tell you a little bit, because I was like, I don't understand how you survive this. Ben is in the water for 8-10 hours a day, just breaststroking. How do you not get lost? Well, he has a sailboat in front of him that drags a line, and he just follows the line, right? Because otherwise it's really easy to just end up pointing any which way, right? So he just follows the sailboat line. When they pick him up at night, and he's really tired, they put a little GPS dot down, and in the morning they make sure to go to that exact dot, and then they just drop him in the water. So that's how he swam. And the people on the sailboat have really one job, which is to make sure they don't lose Ben. And that's a pretty boring job. So he was like, I'll give them a bunch of nets. They can take a bunch of data for you while they're just making sure I don't get lost. And what's great about the samples they took is that there were samples before, inside, and then after the garbage patch. So we have a nice distribution of samples. And this is what one of these samples looks like. So this is a sample from inside the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. This was collected by a net that's shaped like a little ice cream cone with a jar at the end. You just drag it through the ocean surface. And what I want to draw your attention to is that, of course, there's a lot of plastic, which you can see, but all that blue goopy stuff is our stuff. Those are all the animals that we're really interested in. And when I sent these data to a colleague of mine and asked, do you also sometimes see animals at the ocean surface? as a expert who studies plastic at the ocean surface and someone who actually helped discover this garbage patch, she said, oh yeah, but they really stink up our samples, so we just toss them. So we used a variety of methods to essentially quantify the amount of organisms at the air-sea interface. But for the sake of this talk, rather than going through those methods, which are a bit nerdy, I'm just going to show you like a line graph. But if you want to see the really nerdy methods where we correct for a variety of the sort of variables that can be really problematic, largely what we found is that the more plastic you get, the more neustonic animals you get. So this garbage patch was likely a neustonic sea, a neustonic habitat, long before it was ever polluted with plastic. So neuston seemed to co-occur with plastic pollution. And fortunately for us, this wasn't the first time this was found in general. It was the first time it was found in the garbage patch. But others had noticed this exact thing off the coast of Hawaii. So you can see these zebra stripes at the ocean surface. If you've ever stared longingly out at sea, you may have noticed it can be a little stripy. So those stripes are called slicks. And they're areas where stuff seems to collect by wind. And they make up only about 8% of the ocean surface, but nearly 40% of surface fish, 26% of surface invertebrates, and 95% of plastic ends up in these slicks. So whether it's on a small scale or a large scale, we see that life at the surface tends to co-occur with plastic pollution. So that's our first answer. Okay, we see that these animals are concentrated into these high density regions, but that doesn't exactly answer what's going on in terms of why. So we wanted to look at one animal much more closely and see if we could understand the dynamics of the movement of that particular species at the ocean surface. And this is the animal in question. I'm going to sort of highlight the work that's being done by one of my postdocs. So this is the by-the-wind sailor. I left out this neat little fact, which is that by-the-wind sailors come in two different versions. They come in a left-handed version and a right-handed version. We have no idea why. And not only that, we tend to see some versions in some areas and not in others. And this has really infuriated scientists for a very long time. But we do know that the different versions tend to drift in different directions based on the prevailing wind. So lefties tend to go left, and righties tend to go right. This is one of my favorite quotes. Asymmetrical organisms appeal to I can't read it because the zoom is in the way. All right. Asymmetrical organisms appeal to the laws of neither aesthetics nor physics. Someone was really mad about asymmetrical organisms, right? So this is something that has frustrated biologists for a long time. From the above, it appears that the origin and occurrence of the different sizes and morphologies of Velella has not yet been satisfactorily explained. So scientists have been publishing papers for over 50 years trying to understand why they come in these different versions, and they haven't been able to do it. And then finally, a little warning that the distribution of Velella presents challenging and difficult problem containing many whirlpools of error into which incautious investigators may be sucked. So people have been working on this for a while and getting really, really frustrated. So where do Velella occur and why? Well, so this is our amazing team, including Tom over there, who looks like an angel at the United Nations. Sam and Casey are at Yale University, and then of course, Nikolai Maximenko. So a long time ago, a Soviet scientist spent a couple years sailing around the Pacific, collecting life at the surface. And he hypothesized that we have a pattern that works something like this. Right-handed Velella get blown into the middle of the ocean, and left-handed Velella get blown out to shore in the northern hemisphere. And so if you're just in the northern hemisphere, why not just be right all the time, right? You're getting blown into shore all the time in the northern hemisphere if you're left-handed. Well, the problem is that if you go to the southern hemisphere, if you drift across the equator, suddenly the pattern is dramatically reversed. It's better to be left-handed in the southern hemisphere than right-handed. So you're being blown again out to sea. So this was his hypothesis. How do we test that? Well, you need to get observations from all over the world in order to figure out where the lefties and righties are. So we established a community science program where anyone who sees any animal at the ocean surface reports to our sort of organization. And we have since collected thousands and thousands of observations from people around the world. And now we just had the small problem of needing to analyze the distribution of all the left and right-handed animals. So do we do an army of undergrads, right? Poor friends, to sit and look through 12,000 images and code them for left and right? That sounds mind-numbingly boring. Well, so Tom had the sort of intuitive great idea to go to Zooniverse, which is a crowdsourcing platform through NASA that allows people to kind of play with real life data and analyze it for you in sort of a game-ish format. So we put all of our data on Zooniverse and asked random strangers on the internet to analyze it. And this is what we got. So this is a very hard one figure right here. And you can see that Savilov predicted that left-handed animals in blue would be more likely to wash ashore in the northern hemisphere. And we're seeing that in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. And that relatively speaking, right-handed animals would be more likely to wash ashore in the southern hemisphere. And again, we're seeing something like that, a little bit more noisy. We also collaborated with 2 boats crossing the garbage patch, and you can see that Savilov's prediction that right-handed animals would be far out to sea is actually backed up in these data, that they are aggregating in this garbage patch region in the center of the ocean. So next, we wanted to know if left and right-handed animals were even like the same species. Lots of people in the literature said they may be different, and that would kind of break some of the assumptions we're making about why be left or why be right. And if they are different species, we would expect something like this. So here's a family tree. We would expect lefts to all group together and rights to all group together. If they're not different, we would expect to see a mix. Well, when we sequenced genes from these animals, we found that in fact they are not different. Lefties and righties seem to be mixing equally within a single species. So you're either born left or you're born right, but you are within a single species of organisms. And when we look at the numerical models of the ocean surface, you can see that they also back up that righties are being blown into the center of the ocean in the northern hemisphere, which you can see by the little arrow points swirling in the little callus right at that garbage patch region. And lefties are being blown to shore. And lefties along the shore in California, Washington, Oregon, as I mentioned, are forming these massive living islands. And so not only is the handedness of these animals determining their broad global distribution, but it's also lending them to form these aggregations, we think, that impact the surrounding biodiversity. And what I was shocked to realize when we started collaborating with people that do remote sensing is that these concentrations can actually be seen from space. They're so dense that we can pick up these blue strandings of by the wind sailor using satellite imagery. This past spring, we had an even more exciting kind of breakthrough when we began collaborating with Ben Holt at JPL and realized that we can also see them at the ocean surface as these big swirls. And I just want you to note the scale down there, right? So that's a little 5-kilometer measure. And these white swirls, we think are Velella. And part of why we think that is because we've been lucky enough to have community members from our GOSI program out on the water at the same time that the satellites are looking down. And you can see they took pictures of all the Velella covering the ocean surface in the same area where we're seeing these swirly lines on satellites. So these animals are forming huge kilometers long aggregations at the ocean surface. we want to know what kind of impact these massive aggregations are having on biodiversity. So we're also working with Steve Haddock at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute to launch autonomous underwater vehicles that suck water through microscopes and take pictures of everything they see. And using these essentially underwater drones, we've been able to see both animals at the surface and then also the little jellyfish and eggs that they produce. So where are Newston concentrated and why? Well, they seem to be concentrated, at least for Velella, thanks to these mirror image forms which blow them into different regions of the ocean. And we don't know for sure, but my guess is that lefties and righties produce equal numbers of lefty and righty offspring, and just kind of, hedge their bets that 50% of their kids are probably going to wash on the shore at night. So how do we conserve this ecosystem? What kind of threats exist? So here's where we get to the point where I confess that I do a lot of arguing on the internet. It's not a healthy hobby, and I do not recommend it. But I tend to do a lot of arguing with organizations like this. Organizations that mean well, that want to do good things for the environment, propose, for example, to drive catamarans around, scoop up all the plastic in life at the surface, and use it to make biofuels to fuel more driving around and scooping up plastic in life at the surface. No, that's not the solution, right? Some of these are pretty outlandish, like someone proposed a giant floating continent that would be a self-sustaining ocean cleaner, but others are already happening. So folks at an organization called the Ocean Cleanup are already driving giant nets around the North Pacific and the garbage patch to collect plastic. And these nets are truly massive. So they're over 2 kilometers long. They filter 12 football fields worth of water per minute. And their goal is to have 10 of these mega systems working for 10 years. So a couple ships driving a couple nets around might not have a big impact, but what about 10 ships constantly over 10 years? And I'm the kind of wet blanket of the internet, I think, when it comes to these sort of quick techno solutions. So I wanted to know what kind of impact this would have on the high seas. So here's their first press release photo from when they collected plastic. This was back when X was still called Twitter. They tweeted it out. I went and circled all the Velella that I saw in the image and then tweeted it back to them. And, yeah, they really hated that, but it got a lot of attention, which was good. So how do we estimate the impact of these kind of activities on Newstonic animals? Well, this is a broad challenge that we have in conservation generally, which is that most animals are mostly still mysterious to us, right? So we haven't seen the offspring of most oceanic species. We don't know where most ocean species reproduce. We often don't know what they eat, and this creates big challenges. So I just wanted to share the cool way that we sort of estimated something like population growth, how quickly a species can grow from a small number of animals to a large number of animals. And I like this because it's like one of the few things that seems to be almost like a law of physics in the world of biology, when biology tends to break all the laws, right? And that is when you have a tiny animal, imagine like a cockroach, its population grows, unfortunately, fast, right? In the case of a cockroach or a mouse, or God forbid you ever have bed bugs, right? If you have a really large animal over here, its population is going to grow really slowly. So like an elephant. It takes a long time for an elephant population to recover from impacts. And so we can use this to say, okay, all the Newstonic animals fall about here. If you went and started hoovering up all the Newston, how fast would their population be able to recover? And so we use this, keeping in mind that there are a few things we didn't factor in that probably make the situation a little bit harder for Newston, right? So remember that evolutionary history. These are more similar to seafloor ancestors than to things that are floating around, which means they have to bump into other animals to mate, and they have to bump into prey in order to eat. We didn't even take that into account. But if you imagine cleanup over a period of like 10 years, and the percentage of the Newston populations that are sort of caught with 100% being everybody's great and dandy. For high Houston population growth rates, we see about a 5% reduction in the overall population, which on the scale of this graph is not necessarily a lot, but it's still worth considering in the context of something that's meant to be entirely for the benefit of marine animals, right? That you're killing off about 5% of everything out there. But that's the best case scenario. The second best scenario is 20% of all the animals are gone, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. So for species like that snail that need to bump into other snails to mate, we may be looking at massive reductions in their population over the course of this cleanup effort. So this is how I started getting involved in policy, because what do you do now? You're a scientist, you just did a study, you're feeling really great about your results. Who cares? Who cares, right? And so we looked at the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is what sort of manages areas beyond national jurisdiction, and their agreement with the Dutch government where this ocean cleanup operates. And we have found that even though they called for an environmental impact assessment, there were really no clear thresholds for what it meant for them to impact this ecosystem. So all we know is it has to have significant harm to the ecosystem. Is 5% significant? Is 20% significant? Is 50%? What is significant? We don't actually know. It's not defined. They need to take necessary measures to prevent or control risk of serious harm, but what are those measures? And all of this is limited to the first year of operation. They've already been operating for a year, so we're officially done. Right? And they've only had one boat out there, but that's already it. So the legal frameworks were not sufficient. So what we then did was sort of look at these results, that the surface is uniquely vulnerable to human activity, and started examining how we might impact policy to ensure that the ocean surface ecosystem is conserved and protected. And I really liked this quote from The Guardian on our work, which is that Houston, we have a problem. We do not know much about the animals at the air-sea interface and is creating serious challenges. So the high seas needs meaningful biodiversity protection. And I'm happy to report that it is getting that protection. So the UN has been negotiating a treaty to protect biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction for many decades now. The text of this treaty was adopted back in 2023. And as of, where's Gabby? How many minutes ago?
45 or just like 40, like maybe 20 minutes before you started talking, something like that.
As of 20 minutes before I started talking, about 45 minutes ago, this treaty has been freaking ratified. So we have got it. And that means we now have enough countries who bought it, have committed, and said, heck yeah, that we are going to see, and how many days, I forget.
120, yeah.
We're going to see meaningful protection starting in less than a year. And that means conservation areas at the ocean surface. That means powerful environmental impact assessments. That means resource sharing across countries to ensure we can set aside regions of the high seas for protection. This is something that a lot of people have been working on their whole lives. I've been working with a number of scientists, including people like Sylvia Earle, Nicola Clark, to advocate for protection of the high seas, as well as the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty. Plastics Treaty is still ongoing. We're not going to talk very much about that one. It's a little depressing right now, but that's okay. And so in all of these contexts, what I'm doing with my lab and with other scientists is trying to inject the science that we're learning about into the United Nations. And I must say, going to the United Nations as a scientist can be quite intimidating, but it's amazing how hungry UN delegates are for sort of cutting edge science, right? They've got so much to keep track of. It's hard for them to keep track of the science too. And so I just, with the last few minutes, wanted to show you some of the ongoing work we're doing now at the United Nations to ensure this science makes it into the dialogue. I'd never been to the United Nations before. I was not in Model UN. Was anyone here in Model UN? So I'm curious. Heck yeah, awesome. Okay, you guys knew what was happening. I had no idea what was happening. But this is what it looks like when you go to the United Nations. So they've got some big projectors at the front where you can see the chairs of the meeting, essentially in a room very much like this, right? Facilitating discussion where different states will, I kid you not, propose language that goes into a Word document that is also projected on the screen and is edited with like track changes essentially over weeks and weeks and weeks. And what we are working on now is trying to ensure that we move beyond simply this idea of best available science, because on the high seas, we don't have any science, as I've showed you, in many cases, right? We are still discovering ecosystems like the Neustonic ecosystem at the air-sea interface in the garbage patch. We published that paper last year, right? So we are discovering basic stuff about the high seas. So we are working with national delegates to ensure that they're using the kind of language that includes this sort of work, both in the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty, and of course, to ensure that cleanup is something that is taken in a more holistic context. We don't want just nets driving around collecting animals and plastic. We want restoration of these ecosystems. You know, the ecosystem of the ocean surface in the North Pacific can be thought of kind of like a meadow, right? Or forest, right? Do you bulldoze a meadow in order to clean up all the pollution in the meadow? No, that would be crazy, right? But if you know a meadow is really polluted, you don't just want to clean it up, you also want to restore the meadow to like what it was like before the polluted state. So we don't want to just see what we're calling kind of clean washing efforts that make it look really easy, but actually don't have a very positive environmental impact. We want to see actual restoration and conservation. And so a lot of this work, unfortunately, due to the nature of the United Nations, can't be talked about. But I just wanted to give you a quick kind of overview of what success looks like for us. So, for example, in the plastics treaty that's still being negotiated, we've worked over the past few years to ensure that cleanup and cleanup technology, which appeared multiple times in the original text, are replaced with things that have a more ecological and environmentally sort of appropriate language around it. So we just don't want to remove the plastic, we want to restore habitats. To do this, we've been publishing in scientific journals, but we've also been publishing policy briefs, which are often just shared with a handful of people. And we've published a lot of those. And we've also had countless meetings with national delegates from around the world. And success for us means that now cleanup doesn't appear once in the treaty text. It's been entirely replaced by more ecologically sound language like restoration and remediation throughout the text, which is going to hold countries to a higher standard when we talk about removing plastic pollution from the environment. And this is true both in the high seas, but this is also true on land and in coastal zones, that we are providing opportunities for countries to do meaningful conservation work and not just Band-Aid over the problem. Here is me and one of my Georgetown students at the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction negotiations in 2023. This is like the only good picture. In the rest, we look very upset. The only way to learn how to navigate as a scientist at UN meetings is to just go, right? And see what it's like. So we're now building a small but mighty team here at the Earth Commons of scientists who are going to these meetings and building up capacity so that all students at the Earth Commons may have an opportunity to do this in the future. So for an example, I worked with Matthew at BB&J in 2023. And then this year, Matthew took 2 students to another UN meeting in Bonn, Germany. So kind of building out and propagating that expertise forward. Likewise, multiple members of my lab attended the UN negotiations for BB&J this past summer to continue to move those forward. And we are now sort of building UN observer status here at the Earth Commons so that we can bring multiple people to these negotiations and start really injecting science into UN meetings. With, of course, the goal of discovering and conserving our planet's high seas. So with that, I've talked a lot, and I will open it up to any questions. Thank you so much.
So mass basis, think about all the mass of life in the ocean, how much would be, is there any sense of how much is in the high seas?
Oh, wow. I could not even begin to answer that question, but that's a cool question that I bet you could back of the envelope in a really interesting way. So how much mass is in the high seas, like a biodiversity?
Yeah.
Yeah, so a couple of reasons why that would be tricky. A lot of the really chunky invertebrate animals are super fragile. So for example, when you look at like bycatch of non-target species in fishing nets, you can often only measure the bycatch of other kinds of fish because the jellyfish and the comb jellies and the salps have all been torn to shreds. So we would have to do some of that. They're very, heavy in a relative ocean sense. They're mostly water. But then copepods, which are like the little crunchy shrimp guys that a lot of like whales and stuff eat. I've heard you could walk to the moon and back on a trail of copepods. So I know there's a lot of them, but I don't know how much they weigh. We could do that. That would be fun. Thanks. Yeah, maybe.
What were most of these noosed on prior to humans? Since the plastics weren't part of the equation?
They just float. They're just on their own little, so this guy's on his little bubble raft, right? A lot of the rafting organisms were riding around on wood. So we actually have a paper that we've submitted now. So, all right, to zoom out a little bit, right? We got noosed, which aren't really attached to anything. We got rafters, which are attaching to stuff that's floating around. There are a lot of rafters floating around on plastic in the garbage patch. We now have a paper that we have submitted looking at what they could have been on before there was all this plastic. Rise of plastic is related to the fall of forests, right? So plastic is rising, forests are falling, right? In fact, one of the things that plastic was proposed to help with was deforestation because we could replace paper products with plastic products, right? We've lost massive amounts of forest. And when you look at the amount of wood that used to enter the ocean before deforestation and before damming of rivers and logging along rivers, we see that we've lost over 99.5% of it. So there used to be, and we have documents from like early sailors that are crossing the Atlantic, some of them, for like the first or second time, of massive rafts of logs that actually had their own small stands of trees on them. So you had floating logs that were so dense that small trees were growing. We don't see those anymore. Yeah, so that's a habitat we've probably mostly lost.
But your hypothesis is that it's sort of been replaced by plastics.
So it's possible that a lot of the animals we see that are riding on plastic now are almost like refugees. They're kind of hanging out on the only thing that's abundant and floating around on the ocean surface. Now, weirdly, there are dozens of species of animals that only live in the abyss or only live out on the high seas that only eat wood. And they're not going to be okay.
One last question.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you were to sort of go out there and do a census, say it was easy to do, didn't cost $50,000 a day, or you didn't have a swimmer. If you were to look once a week throughout the entire year at the amount of animals attached to things in the Pacific Gyre, would that abundance change? Are there certain times of year where sort of removing plastics would be less impactful to eustonic life than at other times of the year?
So limited data on this, but during the winter, it seems like the sea surface concentrations of these things tends to go down, but it also gets much rougher. It's harder to collect plastics during like the winter season in general than other times of year. But you would have to do sort of multiple surveys across multiple years to really figure out like the species concentration over time. I think you're onto something though, and there has been some preliminary studies doing that, looking at the rise of certain species during certain times of year. What we don't know is what's driving that, right? Are they just more concentrated in that area or are they reproducing? Unclear. Yeah.
What does restoration and remediation on the high seas actually entail?
So that is part of the UN negotiation conversation that we are having. There are organizations that are more local that are also collecting plastic from the high seas that are using different methods that don't involve like big nets, for example, that are removing large pieces of plastic debris essentially by hand. It sounds really ineffective, But numerically and from a cost perspective, it's actually much more effective to do it that way. Especially if you provide like a small dollar amount per unit of plastic collected for when they come back to port. So that would be an example of something that would look more like potential conservation. Restoration, I think, would actually mean thinking about these historic trends involving wood and the like. I don't know if we can go back, but I think we may be able to stop the downward slide a little bit. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
So you said there's a correlation between how many of these species are with, where the plastics collect. I'm curious, over the years, does it actually affect them? Like, do we actually see it there?
I don't know. Yeah, so does plastic harm these animals? We are not really sure. So one of the things you need to do to perform that kind of study is keep them in captivity. And I'm very happy to say that in moving to this new building, we now have facilities to raise animals. And we are about to get a bunch of jellyfish in the lab, like this month. I don't know where Megan is. Hello. Okay, all right, we got our jellyfish wrangler here. So we're about to get a bunch of jellyfish in the lab and work on these processes of starting to grow these animals in captivity and see what happens. Jellyfish are pretty robust, so I could see it being anything from not hugely impacted to being very impacted. We got to do the studies. Yeah. Questions? Yes.
Continue on the restoration in the high seas, how would you deal with microplastics or just small plastics?
So I confess that I very quickly realized microplastics were like a hole that you could be sucked in and never really emerge from, right? That's another kind of whirlpool. So in the case of microplastics, there's been a lot of debate about whether it's worth trying to remove them from the environment in every ecosystem, including shore and terrestrial. And generally from conversations that I've had with people that think about these very seriously, the answer is that there's no real way to remove microplastics that's not going to impact other organisms, right? So you can't get them out of the soil. It's hard to get them out of sand. Part of the choice to use language like remediation is because remediation, unlike cleanup, takes into account those costs and benefits. So here, for example, in the US, if you have something like Superfund site that has a lot of pollution in the soil, you'll do a cost-benefit analysis of which is more impactful, leaving the pollutant or removing it. And then if leaving it is the better option for the ecosystem, then you start thinking about ways to reduce the harm that that has on the broader ecosystem over time. And I think that's where we're going to have to go with a lot of microplastics in a lot of places. Yeah, so we're at time.
We are at time for one more question.
All right,
Okay,
yes,
last
thank
question.
you.
Thank you for the speech. I'm interested in the BBNJ, and I'm wondering like how many countries in the world are participating in and collaborating on this high seas treaty.
So we just got 60 countries that sort of signed on to the ratification process. And then I forget how many have added their signature. Do you remember?
It's like 150 something, 153.
So I did not understand this process when I started working for the UN, but they negotiate until they find a text where everyone's happy. They adopt the text. It's translated into all the UN languages. And then if countries want to have the intention of ratifying, they add a signature. And that says, hey, I'm preparing our internal national policies to comply with this. And then once they're compliant ready, they ratify. And so right now we have over 100 countries that have said, yes, we are preparing our national processes for this, and 60 countries that have said we're ready to go.